Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream Future by podcast. And tonight I am joined by my co-host DjSeanski. And tonight we're going to be discussing a bit about Paul's chronology. So I'm going to be going through some of the evidence I discussed last time, and with additional information to go along with that. So let's get started with asking ourselves this question. How do we date Paul's letters? Well, there are scholars with different opinions on how to answer that question. You can even look at some of the interviews I've done on my channel. A lot of scholars will date the letters in the 50 CE. Most scholars will. But some will see some of the letters as being a little later, early 60 CE, or maybe mid 60 CE at the latest. But then you have some that fall into the early camp, and we'll put it in the 40 CE. And I knew that eventually I would have to come to my own opinion on when these texts date. And let me fix this. Okay, there we go. And I was intrigued by some that point out that the letter to the Romans looks like it was composed before the expulsion from Rome took place. And I thought about that. I'm like, okay, so Romans 16, Paul mentions Aquila and Priscilla, and they're still in Rome. And Acts of the Apostles says that Aquila and Priscilla were expelled from Rome as part of Emperor Claudius' expulsion of the Jews out of Rome. But when did that expulsion take place? In the last live stream, I suggested it happened in probably in 50 CE, definitely no earlier than early 50 CE. I'm sorry, not no earlier. I meant to say no later than early 50 CE. But why do I say that? Well, because the Christian Paulus Orosius, who composed in the 4th century CE, I think it was, Paulus Orosius says that the expulsion from Rome happened in the 9th year of Claudius, which would unmistakably date it to early 50 CE, or at least sometime in 50 CE. But Acts of the Apostles thinks that the expulsion from Rome happened 2 years before Gallo was appointed consul in Achaia. So that would put it in 49, actually, just a little earlier. When I was talking to James Valiant about this, he pointed out to me that Tacitus in his Annals covers the entire year of 50 CE. At first, I didn't think of it much as a problem, but I thought about it some more, and I realized, okay, Tacitus would obviously be much more reliable than Paulus Orosius. Tacitus is writing in the early 2nd century CE. He's a near contemporary of the event. He was born later than the event, of course, but he's a near contemporary. So he's much closer to the time. He's a Roman historian. He's got a lot right. So obviously, we should prioritize him over anything Paulus Orosius has to say about the matter. And given Acts of the Apostles seems to already put it in 49, and the fact that Tacitus doesn't seem to mention it, because we're missing some of Tacitus's works, like his coverage of the 40 CE, a lot of that's gone. There's several years of Claudius's reign that's missing from Tacitus's letters, Tacitus's Annals, excuse me. His coverage of the Jewish war was also omitted, by the way. Christian copyists left the chapters he wrote about the Jewish war out. We don't have his take on it. We have Josephus, obviously. We don't have Tacitus's take on the Jewish war, which is curious. Begs the question, why did they leave it out? What did they not like about that? It's curious. But until we find those texts, we can only speculate as to why. But it is not too difficult to imagine that this was done because Tacitus had said some things that those copyists didn't like, something that didn't fit Christian theology very well, or the Christian theology of the time. But not just of the time, but so much later too, because there would have been many opportunities for them to copy it. I'm sure those chapters survived for quite a while before they just totally faded away into history. But regardless, all the copyists seem to just totally agree in not copying those specific chapters they left out of Tacitus. So that's interesting. Josephus. Let's shift to Josephus, because that's really where I think we start getting, in my view, a clear answer as to when Paul's writing his letters. Josephus says that Clemens, he implicates a Clement. He alleges that Clement was involved in the assassination of Emperor Caligula in 41 CE. And Paul, if that's the Clement he's talking about, and there's a few reasons why I think it's likely the case, and I'll go through them each reason very carefully. Philippians by itself is not evidence that the Clement is not enough evidence that the Clement that Paul mentions is the one that assassinated Caligula, because that's a bold claim that I'm making there. I need evidence. I need to give my evidence of that. 2 Thessalonians is a text I need to call upon for it, because that text is clearly anti-Caligula. Because 2 Thessalonians describes Emperor Caligula as violating Jewish law, a son of lawlessness, as violating Jewish law. He wants to go inside the temple and declare himself God. Who did that in the 1st century CE? It was Emperor Caligula. He wanted to put himself in, he wanted to put an image of himself inside the temple. He declared himself God too. The way that the Roman emperors were deified is like saints. You don't become sanctified until after you're dead. You don't become a god until after you're dead, in Rome's case. The emperor doesn't become god until after they're dead. And the same thing with their empresses or their wives. Well, they're not empresses. I misspoke there, but the wives of the emperors were also deified into goddesses. We know that, just like the emperor was. Okay, so back to what I was trying to get at. So Suetonius and Caligula. Yeah, Suetonius on Caligula, excuse me. Suetonius describes Caligula as wanting to put an image of himself inside the temple and declare himself God. And Josephus says the same thing, especially Josephus. That's not something he'd like to talk about, because that's Josephus. Josephus is not a fan of Caligula, so I mean, he talked about it to criticize Caligula, of course. Okay. So when we put those pieces together, Philippians is a prison letter. Paul is saying he's in bonds when he wrote that letter. So what I'm getting at is that after Caligula's death, and by the way, before I go any further, he keeps talking about Caesar's household in Romans and Philippians. Caesar's household here, Caesar's household over there, in these different letters he's writing. And I'm like, that seems to be very specific that he's talking about the emperor's house. So he has political connection to the emperor, and to the Praetorian Guard, as he clearly refers to in Romans. Philippians as well. And I think he references the Praetorian Guard in both texts. Yeah, that they're there one way or the other. So Paul is having these conversations with the Praetorian Guard. They're cool with him. He's cool with them. They're buddies. Paul's being treated very well, even though he keeps saying, I'm in bonds, but he's being treated very well. So it's kind of funny, a luxurious prison imprisonment, to put that in proper words, I guess. Mm-hmm. Okay. So when you put 2nd Thessalonians together in Philippians, it looks like to me that Philippians was written before 2nd Thessalonians, because by the time he's writing 2nd Thessalonians, that Clement guy's dead. He was executed for his involvement in Caligula's death. So that guy's out of the way. So when he's writing 2nd Thessalonians with his co-authors Timothy and Silas, he's talking about the son of lawlessness, what he did, and it mirrors Caligula very well. And he's trying to paint a picture of prophecy, trying to make it look like, I kind of knew about this. I kind of knew this was going to happen, and he knew that Jesus was going to defeat him in some way, that Jesus would plan his downfall, because that's kind of the way he's describing Jesus, that Jesus is going to bring down the son of lawlessness for what he's done. And so he's just having fun ripping Caligula to shreds in this text as the son of lawlessness. Caligula's dead. Paul's free from prison. Everybody hates Caligula now. So he doesn't have anything to worry about. He's not going to be arrested for writing 2nd Thessalonians, even if they realize he's talking about Caligula. Doesn't matter anymore. He got off scot-free. He was clearly not implicated any further in his assassination. Clement is out. Clement's never mentioned by Paul ever again. Philippians briefly mentions Clement, but he's out of the game. But that gets us to the early 40s when Paul is writing these texts. At least that's my view on the matter. But when he wrote Romans, I can't imagine he wrote any earlier than 48 CE, given that Aquila and Priscilla were still in Rome. And in 49, Paul in Romans says he's on his way to Rome. He's going to come to Rome, but he's going to go to Spain. And by the way, 1st Clement, not written by that Clement, but somebody else decades later. 1st Clement confirms he made it to Spain. And in Romans, Paul states he's going to come back. He's going to come back to Jerusalem. He's going to swing back around. And it looks like to me he's swinging back around because he's a bit upset. Because, and this is where I have to agree with scholars that put Galatians after Romans. And there are scholars that put Galatians before Romans. I think it's after Romans. Because Paul is circling his way back to Jerusalem. He's upset at what's going on in Galatia. He's upset at what he's hearing. So he's writing his letter to the Galatians because the Galatians are... Paul is upset at them for buying into Torah orthodoxy. He literally makes statements in Galatians that Jesus' death frees them from the law. They don't need to circumcise. And at one point, and I think this happened, he took a pit stop to Antioch before he decided to go down to Jerusalem, but perhaps for the second and final visit. I would have to look at that again, but one way or the other, he goes down to Antioch and he confronts Cephas, that's Peter, to the face. He confronts him to the face. They're getting mad at each other because what happened is that Cephas sat down he sat down, was eating his food, and then other Gentiles sat down next to him, but they were not circumcised. So Cephas, being a circumcised Jew, got up and departed from them because he does not want to sit next to people that are uncircumcised. This bothered him. And so this upset Paul. That's why Paul says he confronted Cephas to the face. He's mad. Real mad. It's like, that shouldn't matter to you, Cephas. But Cephas has to maintain his Torah orthodoxy. And so that's why they confronted each other to the face. But then, curiously, some men were sent to the area, men of James. And this kind of causes Paul to get out of Dodge. So it looks like those men were about to give Paul a beating, if not worse. So Paul got out of there. And Clement, in Clement's letter, again, reminder, it's not the same Clement. The person that wrote First Clement is the Bishop of Rome in the 90s. So he's writing like 50 years after Paul's death. thereabouts. And Clement seems to think that Paul was killed due to religious violence, religious rivalry. And Paul feared that something like that would happen to him. He was afraid of a violent incursion upon him in these different places he was traveling, because somebody just might get pissed off enough to attack him. And it looks like that's exactly what happened. In this case, I would wonder, maybe a zealot, a Jewish zealot, or the zealots had him killed. He was getting on their nerves. Just read Galatians. Because when he wrote Galatians, Paul's ministry, his churches are spread out. He's already done his stuff. He's already done a lot of his work. For them to get so agitated like that, if you get my point, like Galatians looks like they're spread out, and the Torah Orthodox Jews are trying to combat Paul's ministry. They're trying to combat what Paul has done. They're trying to send people out to Galatia and other places because they don't want them to follow Paul. And it looked like that Paul at one point had the Galatians convinced, because he's really pissed off at the Galatians that are no longer convinced. And he writes Ephesians 2, and Ephesians looks a lot like the argument he's making in Galatians. Although he's not as upset at the Ephesians as he was with the Galatians. When you read Ephesians, it makes a similar point that Galatians does, because Galatians says there's never free nor slave, man, woman, Jew, Gentile. He's saying that because he's trying to say everybody's equal under Christ. Everybody's under Christ. I'm not so sure about the equal part, but he's definitely trying to say, look, one way or the other, we're all under Christ. And in Ephesians, he says the wall between Gentile and Jew has come down. I have to fix my green screen. And that has to remind us of what Paul says in Galatians when he's trying to say, look, we're all under the law here, under Jesus' law, but not the Torah orthodoxy. We're all under Jesus. And in Ephesians, he tries to paint that same picture of unity. And that's what he does. And there are scholars that say Ephesians is fake. There are others that say it's authentic. It's hugely divided as to whether Paul wrote Ephesians or not. And some say it's a mixed bag. Sometimes, like, parts of it were written by Paul, but then it might have been interpolated or Paul's scribe contributed a bit to it, some hypothetical scribe. Ephesians is not co-authored, by the way. Just bear that in mind. I don't see a problem with Ephesians personally. I think it's fine the way it is. Let me see something here. So I think that's the best way that the letters of Paul, in my view, is that you have to look at the events that Paul's talking about. You have to look at the son of lawlessness being Caligula. You got to look at what's happening in 49 CE, that Paul wrote Galatians prior. He wrote Romans and Galatians prior to the expulsion, as it seems. Well, certainly Romans prior to the expulsion. I think that's clear in my view. So this video is kind of serving as a correction to the previous one, because I suggested 50 CE as the most likely date for the expulsion, but it seems clear to me now, based on earlier and more reliable data, the precise date is 49 CE. But it is, to me, it's a minor adjustment. It's just 1 year. And it might have even been less than a year. It might not even be a full year, because it could have been in late 49 CE for all I know. So that being said, Sean, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, Romans, am I echoing?
No, you're not.
Okay, Romans written before Ephesians, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I don't think I explicitly stated that earlier, but yes, I do. That happens to be my position.
Okay.
Yes, I do think Romans is written before Ephesians.
Do you see Paul at any point in his ministry using any Old Testament legalism? I've heard that before, that especially in Romans, because for many Christians, Romans 9 poses a problem because everything is for Israel. He's a Benjamite. God hates Esau, loves Jacob.
Let me get the
Do you
references in
see?
front of me.
Yeah, do you see any Old Testament legalism at all in Paul's ministry? Just in general, I know Romans has always been controversial that way.
Yeah.
I've heard that before. Women being quiet in the churches seems a bit extreme, but I've heard that accusation that Paul's intertwining Old Testament legalism into his ministries. Not so much circumcision. We know what he says about that. Yeah, it's just want your opinion on that.
Sure.
Because I've read recently where there's a Christian that read Romans 9 and some years ago and just was like that turned them away, or this person away from Christianity. So just your take on that, if you don't mind.
Well, let me take a look here. It's in Romans 9, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Where he's reinforcing the covenant and everything is still for Israel. So what's your take on that? If we had to kind of talk about that for a second.
I think that when you look at Galatians, we have to be very careful here because yes, Romans 9, now that I've taken another look at it and I'm reminded of its content, it's like he's arguing for the Old Testament law. It looks like that at first, but we have to be very careful because Paul states something in Galatians. He says, I am all things to all men. He's basically admitting he's a liar. Even though he said in other places that I'm not a liar. He says this in one of his letters to Corinthians. He also says this in Galatians. I'm not a liar. I don't lie. But what it means to be all things to all men is he will deliberately hold contradictory views, say contradictory things, to make and appease anybody, to appease anyone in any given position, in any situation. So we need to be careful because like some try to rescue the idea, like putting like Paul within Judaism. That hey, he actually doesn't contradict Torah orthodoxy. I'm like, read Galatians.
And I'm sorry, Romans was written before the expulsion, is what you were saying.
That's right.
Okay, not before Galatians. I'm my bad.
No, Romans. I think Romans was written before Galatians. That's correct.
Okay, still too.
I think Romans is before the expulsion too.
Okay. And that's just a question because it's come up a lot, when I'm doing my research, that some Christians kind of view Paul with a grain of salt because of certain scripture that kind of renders back to Judaism or Orthodox Judaism, the law, so to speak, where he flip-flops a little bit. You said he's all things to all men. He looks like he flip-flops a little bit depending on the time and situation.
That's right. It's important to note that when it comes right down to Romans chapter 10, just after 9, Paul talks about Israel's rejection of Christ. So what he's trying to do is, you're going to look at Romans 9, he's trying to use the Old Testament against them. Then in Romans 10, he comes around and says, he criticizes the Israelites for rejecting Jesus Christ. So it's like, at first it looks like he's trying to follow Old Testament legalism when he really isn't. Because he's trying to twist the Old Testament, bend it, so it fits in his criticisms of Israel for their rejection of Christ.
Okay.
That's what he's doing.
Yeah. I've always looked at Paul as not a very trustworthy person. He has blood on his hands. He does. I looked at it always that he's responsible for Stephen's death or Stephen's death. Right from the jump, things get off to a bad start, so to speak.
That's an axe. Stephen's death is an axe.
Yeah. And that would be the road to Damascus story chronologically. How would that be placed within the framework of everything? Still prior to the expulsion. Is that correct?
Stephen's death is dated by most to be in the 40s and before the expulsion. But I've said before that I actually doubt if Acts of the Apostles is describing the same individual that wrote the letters. Because you have this Saul guy who's having his vision in the 60s, by the way, 30 years after Paul had his vision in that he talks about 2 Corinthians. Because Paul's vision happened in the 30s. The vision of the one that we're supposed to think is Paul in Acts is 30 years later. I'm not kidding. And in Acts, it never mentions Paul's letters too, which I find that strange. And on top of that, the Paul in Acts seems to meet Aquila and Priscilla for the first time after they were expelled from Rome, which contradicts Romans massively. And I'm like, that is just utterly bizarre. And the contradictions go much deeper than that. It looks like to me, even Jerome, who's writing in the late 4th century CE, he seems to know something about the Paul in Acts that is not contained in any of the other texts that survived. He says that Saul was born in Giscala and that he and his family fled to Tarsus after Giscala was taken. I'm like, wait a minute, that's the Jewish war. You're talking about the late 60s CE when Giscala was taken in a battle when the Romans captured it. So he's not even known as Saul of Tarsus until the late 60s? How does that work with Paul writing much earlier than that? There's a problem there. To me, the best explanation for that, this is just me, but the best explanation for that is it's not even the same guy. And they're being conflated. They're being assumed to be the same person by later reinterpretation. And that would explain why Acts has so much biographical contradictions with Paul. And here's another point. Philippians. Paul and Timothy write Philippians. Paul brags about being a Hebrew of Hebrews, being a descendant, being a Benjamite. I'm like, hold on. You would tell me Paul says these things, but leaves out himself being supposedly taught by Gamaliel, the leader of the Sanhedrin? Because in Acts, Saul of Tarsus was taught by Gamaliel. That's what Acts says. You're going to tell me Paul left that out of the Philippians when he was bragging to be the Hebrew of the Hebrews? No, I don't think so. I'm not buying that for a second. Makes better sense that those are two different people. And it's like, oh, no wonder why Acts doesn't mention Paul's letters, because it's trying to paint Saul as being Paul, or at least a Paul. But if you mention the letters, you're going to have to explain the contradictions there. And the author of Acts like, I'm not going to do that. I ain't getting into that. I'm not getting into that mess. He leaves it out. And then you wonder why Jerome thinks that he becomes Saul of Tarsus and has his vision in the 60s pretty much. I'm like, that's just like Acts, Paul's visions in the 60s. And I'm like, yeah, that's a serious contradiction, because Paul's already running away from Aretas in 37 CE, as he says in 2 Corinthians 11. So that's another way of dating Paul. Look at that. Late 30s is already at it. And then you just add the other evidence, his imprisonment in 41 CE in the wake of Caligula's death, his assassination, that is, writing Romans before the expulsion of the Jews in 49 CE. And I'm like, you just add that evidence together. I'm like, Paul's ministry seems to be happening at just about that time. So I think we have the chronology pretty well established in this video. The exact order of the letters and when all of them are written, that's another time. I'm gonna have to do a whole pre-recorded video about that. I just haven't gotten around to doing that just yet. Let's do this live stream just for fun, going over. What was that, Sean? I didn't hear it.
Yeah, I'm just saying. Yeah, we talked about this some years ago.
Yeah,
it seems like now. Jeez.
Yeah, some of this I thought about a long time ago, but then like I came back to it. I'm like, I think that view is correct. Should have stuck to that view, but I'm back there at least now. So, another thing to bear in mind is 2 Corinthians. Dating that one is I think a bit easy, actually, because Galatians is written in 49, 17 years after the crucifixion of Jesus in 32 CE. That's what it comes off as, to me at least. And by the way, if you read 2 Corinthians and Galatians, and you don't even have to agree with my dating to go along with this, it's very clear that 2 Corinthians is written 3 years before whenever Galatians was written. How do I know that? 2 Corinthians says the vision happened 14 years before he wrote 2 Corinthians. And in Galatians, it was written 3 years plus 15 days plus 14 years after his vision. So, okay. So he wrote Galatians 3 years after 2 Corinthians. You just do the basic math. Got it. So that would put 2 Corinthians in 46 CE if the date for Galatians in 49 CE is correct. I'll take a couple of these questions here. Looks like we're not getting any super chat. I'll take some free questions.
You have some good ones in there.
New Genesis connection. Thank you for your question. Paul was kinsman of the Herodians. He was of the Herodian family and Edomite. Why wouldn't he be treated first class and have 400 Roman troops escort him back to Rome? I think the 400 troops detail comes from Acts, and I do not take Acts seriously when it comes to Paul. I'll respond to the kinsman part. Romans 16 says that Romans 16:11 that Paul is a kinsman to the Herodians. Some try to dance around that and say, well, Herodians are the name of other people too. You can't be sure it's the Herodians. I'm like, actually, yes, I can, because read the verse just before that. Romans 16:10 says, salute Apollos approved in Christ, salute them which are of Aristobulus' household. The very next mention after that, he mentions Herodians. Aristobulus, at least as far as my knowledge goes, as far as I know, Aristobulus is a name exclusive to the Herodian family at that time. So explain that to me. Those that criticize the idea that Paul's a Herodian, I've interviewed some scholars on the show that agree that Paul's a Herodian, like Robert Eisenman, James David Odlin. There's also an apologist, Taylor Marshall. Even he sees it, that Paul's a Herodian. Isn't that interesting? So yeah, there are scholars, not many, admittedly, but there are scholars out there that see what I'm seeing for Romans 16. Let's take the super chat question. Porter Rockwell Enjoyer, thank you for your super chat. Are you a Memphis Jacob? Absolutely not. No. I think Memphisism is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. There's a couple of people I had on my show in the past, like
myth is
Go ahead, Sean. Sorry.
We've talked about this. Myth is intertwined into this era, and prior to that era, it was vogue at the time. It was vogue for the mythology to be layered on top of people's stories. Like Jacob says, you're embellished. The women, empresses and the Roman emperors, they're embellished through mythology. They all were in all the cultures at that time. But just because you're embellished through mythology doesn't make you a mythical person or character that's kind of just made up out of thin air.
Right.
We've talked about this a lot. It's just their style at the time. the mythology plays a great role in how people perceive themselves.
Oh, I hope I don't mean to interrupt. Just want to butt in and say this real quick. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, almost forgot about this, that he fled from King Aretas. I mentioned that earlier. If someone doubts that Paul's a Herodian, combine the evidence, the unlikelihood of this being a coincidence. I mean, I go as far as saying it's an impossibility when you add Aretas. It's a possibility if the evidence is only Romans 16, or if the evidence is only Aretas. But you got both together? Not a chance. He's fleeing from King Aretas. He says he's a kinsman of Herodians. He doesn't tell us why he fled from King Aretas. I'm like, we put 2 and 2 together. Josephus says in 37 CE that King Aretas and Herod Antipas are going at each other. Aretas is attacking the Herodians. He sends an army after them. He wants to wipe out the Herodians. He wants to capture and wipe them out. That's what he wants. So Paul's mere relationship, his mere bloodline, that's what happened. He was related to the Herodians by blood. That's why Aretas wanted Paul dead. He didn't capture him. He managed to escape. But that's what happened. You just put 2 and 2 together. And I don't know how anyone can counter that. I really don't. It's beyond me. And it's ironic, too, that the Herodian family should be so despised in the Gospel of Matthew later, with the Gospel of Matthew, which would pretty much give birth to the anti-Herodian ideas in Christianity. Like, everybody hates Herod the Great. Everybody hates him because of Matthew's Gospel. And yet Paul himself, writing much earlier, is a Herodian. I just find that very ironic. Give me 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
You see any questions in the chat there that you might?
Well, Paul, I'm just a comment. Paul ate too many peyote buttons.
Remember, you can click it, Sean. You have a control as well.
Paul ate too many peyote buttons. I mean, just a comment. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm gonna talk a little bit more about. Oh, what was that, Sean?
Go ahead, Jacob. Okay. No, go ahead, man.
Yeah. So I think I'll just set that to the side. Okay, so what was I gonna say? I lost my train of thought. Oh yes, Paul being a Herodian infiltrator. A patron asked me to talk about this for a little bit, and I was going to anyway. Quite frankly, yeah. Paul just suddenly decides, "Hey, I'm gonna jump in and, join the Jesus guys." It's just after the crucifixion happens too. I'm like, that's some interesting timing there. It's like, oh, hey, everybody, I had a vision. Yeah, I totally had that vision. I totally didn't make that up. Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely he actually had a vision. I think he just made it up. Totally made it up as an excuse. Try to give himself authority to join the movement.
You talking about the road to Damascus story, Jacob?
I think that I actually think his flight. I think his vision happened before his flight from Damascus, because he was fleeing Damascus at 37 CE. That's not when he had his vision. He was getting out of there because of Aretas. So the vision took place prior.
I've always had a problem with that story because there's 3 different accounts of the same story. I mean, what really happened? I don't know.
And
I've always looked at it that way.
Who's chasing Paul? And when he's fleeing Aretas too, there's a contradiction there. 2 Corinthians says it's Aretas. Acts thinks it's Jews chasing Paul. That's what Acts says. So I think that, again, if you go with me on the idea that's not the same guy, that solves your problem. Forget Acts. Just throw it out the window. Doesn't matter.
So you're saying Acts was Saul?
Yeah, Saul, different guy.
Okay.
Different guy. Like, about this. Here's another reason to think they're not the same guy. Clement, who's writing in the late 90s, mid-late 90s CE, he's writing a bunch of stuff. First, Clement, maybe the second one, if you think that's authentic or not. There's a debate there. A lot of people say that's fake. Then you have the Clementine recognitions, which, by the way, we don't have the original recognitions because in the early 5th century CE, a piece of crap called Tyrannus Rufinus, who admits to manipulating the text, doesn't tell us how much damage he's done to the text. He just adds a preface that says, "Hey guys, I messed with this text." I'm just letting everybody know. Like, it literally admits that. So, fortunately, we have a different version. We have a different manuscript of it that seems to at least restore something he tried to erase from the text. That Saul murdered James, the brother of Jesus. That's what it says. Saul killed James. Saul and a mob following Saul were beating James and his followers to death. And according to Robert Eisenman, he thinks that the Stephen in Acts is actually a literary replacement for James. I think that there was a Stephen. I think he's different from James, but it looks like in Acts, Stephen is being rewritten to take the role of James. Because in Acts of the Apostles says Stephen did not resist Saul. Saul was killed. Stephen did not offer any resistance. In the Clementine recognitions, James resists. But in the Epistle of James, which I think was written in between the two texts, the Epistle of James says, "You have killed the righteous one who doth not resist you." I think that's James 5:13, if I remember correctly. But it's in chapter 5. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I see what Acts is doing. He's using the letter of James. He's using the recognitions at the same time. And he's trying to, Luke, who's writing Luke Acts, is trying to wrestle with, okay, I don't want to say that Saul killed James. That's going to be a big problem. Clement's already making a mess of things when he tells us that. So let me just say that was Stephen. And by the way, there is a Stephen and Josephus that was killed in the 40s. So I think Acts is like using the Stephen that was killed by zealots, by the way, in around 48 CE. It's like, let me write the story around that guy. So that guy is the one being killed who did not resist Saul instead of James. So that way he tries to avoid saying that it was actually James and not Stephen that Saul was involved in the death of. It would be less controversial. But it's already a very strange thing because Stephen's the first Gentile convert. He's getting killed not long after he converted. So there's that. And I think that's a more logical position to take than Eisman tries to outright saying James and Stephen are the same guy. Exactly. Like, no. I think there had to be a historical Stephen that was originally separate. Because, like, imagine an actor, right? In a Hollywood movie. So let's say the actor he has to get out of there. Either something bad was revealed about him, or he's like, I can't do this. I'm dropping out. I'm not going to play this character. So let's say Stephen's that actor, okay, Sean? And I'm sorry, James. James is the actor. James is the actor that's dropping out. And Stephen's like, I'll take over his role. You see the analogy? You get it? So Stephen's like, I'm going to take over the role of James in Acts. That's it. It's not like this is exactly the same person, because I think making that identification would be stupid. But Stephen is anachronistically being given the role of James. You follow me? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Anything interesting in the chat?
Yeah, there's a couple.
Pull them up.
Let's see where we are. We have.
I'm not going to even try pronouncing that whole name. So
Powillo.
Powillo, thank you for your super chat. How do you date 2 Corinthians relative to Galatians if you take 2 Corinthians as an amalgamation of letters, or do you not believe that about 2 Corinthians? I think that Frank Hughes makes a strong case that 1 and 2 Corinthians is many different letters that were compiled together. But they're also both co-authored, by the way, something to bear in mind. So I think that, I guess, the letters to the series of letters that we call 2 Corinthians was written about probably in a span of a bit, but it looks like at least a piece of it was written 3 years before Galatians, given what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11. That's the best answer I can give you to that question. Thank you, though. Oh, by the way, I'll add to that. Galatians says that Paul says in Galatians, he wrote Galatians 17 years after his visions, 3 years plus 15 days plus 14 years. And in 2 Corinthians is written 14 years after the vision. So that's how I know 2 Corinthians and Galatians are 3 years apart. You can look at it yourself. It's there. Thanks for the question.
Got another one too, Jacob.
Awesome. Mike8903, thank you for your super chat. What about Paul being lowered in a basket? Wouldn't this suggest that Paul was very young when this event took place to be light enough to be lowered? Well, King David was lowered himself in the Old Testament. Look, when you're, I used to think about that a while back, but I abandoned that idea that he was young or even an infant. I'm like, I think Saul was probably an infant around this time, but not Paul. The historical Paul who wrote the letters was most certainly an adult in the late 30s CE. Because he says in Philemon when he wrote that in the 40s CE, he's aged. He calls himself aged, the aged Paul. So he considers himself quite old in the 40s. So imagine you're Paul. You're trying to get out of Damascus. You're in a building, and you got to get out of there. There might be people there might be Aretas' troops running up the stairs looking for him. Like, I better get out of here. I can't go back downstairs because I go down there, Aretas' soldiers are going to capture me and probably kill me. So he's like, I'm going to get in a basket and lower my way down. It might break and I might fall to my death, but worth the risk. So that's the way I look. That's the way I look at what Paul was saying, because like I feel like he was pretty desperate. There must have been people in that house looking for him, and that's why he was getting out of there. Why he lowered himself out of the basket. That's my answer to your question, Mike. But thank you.
Thanks what, Mike. I don't know. I've always looked at this thing too, like flip floppy. Saul is a Hebrew name that he mainly used around the Romans. But then he uses his
the one in Acts.
Yeah. The one in Acts. And then but when he's with his people, he's using his Roman name, and it's like that's Paul, not Saul. Like that's kind of backwards. I always look at it backwards. I mean, that's just my take on it. Saul versus Paul, flip-flopping the names. Like people know me as DjSeanski from where I'm from, but then my proper name is Sean Andrews. So in certain circles, I use certain names, and it looks to me like sometimes it's just backwards in the scriptures. Like, okay, I might be looking at it a little silly, but it's just an observation when I was a lot younger.
I understand that, and I wouldn't think it's much of a problem, especially since they're two different people in my view.
Yeah,
and sometimes I say, well, and some people might be like, why are you saying Saul and Paul are two different people? I'm like, they'll be like, it's the same name. He's just giving himself a Roman name. That's what they're saying. That's what somebody might say against this. I'm like, but that's not even the reason why I'm saying this. By the way, I would still say I find it strange he left that out of his letters. But okay, let's throw that to the side. How do you explain those very serious contradictions I mentioned earlier? Big ones. It's more than just a name. Big contradictions that only make sense if it's two different people. He didn't flee from Damascus twice, and in the basket from two different people in two different time periods that are going after him. Even Heisman laughs at that. Heisman doesn't assume it's two different people, though. but he recognizes that Acts seriously contradicts the letters. He sees that at least. But to me, the contradictions are so bad. There's so many that I'm like, just merely saying Acts is unreliable doesn't cut it. It's something more serious here. It's not even the same guy. Yeah.
Doesn't seem that way to me. You know, that's why I brought it up. Like, it just seems weird. Like, you know, yeah, it seems really, it's just always was odd, the name change. And you're around certain people, you should be using it. You know,
well, I think to a degree, Acts is trying to conflate the two characters, and that's why Acts leaves out the letters, because the character conflation would be in conflict with Paul's letters. So that's why I think maybe you might be leaning towards that direction too. That makes the best sense. That these are two different people.
Yeah.
Because I mean, ask Clement. I forgot to make this full point earlier. Clement talks about Paul in First Clement. He's like, "Oh, Paul is such a great guy. He died. He was killed for his faith. We all should remember his example." But then he writes recognition and says, "Saul is evil. He murdered James." I'm like, so you just talked about Paul in another text, followed by his example. In another text, Saul's a murderer. And he never says it's the same guy, by the way. Never. So I think Clement wrote before Acts. I think that's easy to say. Which also fits Acts using Josephus. But you're about to say something, I can tell.
Yeah, because then sometimes I look at things in very common sense terms, how you're doing right now.
Yeah.
And I've had to use examples where you have a guy that's from the hood, let's say, and he has committed a murder. Okay. And people in the streets know that this guy committed a murder. And he has a change of heart out of nowhere, and he's a new person. I'm not following that guy. I mean, there were drug dealers and gangbangers when I was growing up. Just going to let the audience know. And when you knew people behaved a certain way, you just leave them alone, man. No matter if they had a change of heart, and now I'm, I've changed and I'm all about the Lord and stuff. Follow me. We're going to go like, wait, hold on. Isn't this the guy that killed such and such and such? I don't want anything to do with this guy. And I'm just bringing it up that way. It seems as though if you are responsible for anybody's death, you look at that person in real life like, I'm going to be leery of that person. But we kind of give Paul a pass. No, people give Paul a pass in the scriptures. I don't give him a pass. If he's a killer and a murderer, that's what he is. I mean, but it seems as though there could be two different characters in this situation.
Even the split, even if one recognizes the two different people, Paul in the letters still admits he was persecuting Christians. He was hunting them down. Well, he doesn't use the term Christian. The term Christian didn't exist yet.
Right. We mentioned
60 years,
that before.
50, 60 years later. But, 40, 50 years later, I'm about to say. But anyway, he was hunting down the brothers of the Lord, because that's what the movement was called in Paul's letters, brothers of the Lord. And since this vision happened in 32 CE, it would look like he was hunting them down while Jesus was still alive. Not sure if Paul ever met Jesus or not. Some might think it's a possibility. I would say he didn't, because he would brag about that. It's like, hey, I met the man. I met the man himself. He was alive. But he doesn't. He says, it was in a vision. Yeah. I saw the ghost Jesus. Yeah. He came to see me.
I've always had a problem with that too, because then it seems to me that we get to the book of Acts. Now all of a sudden Jesus is a showboater. He's showboating. Boom, here I am. And I went blind and I went down, and he's showboating. Like Paul puts Jesus out there as a showboater now. Jesus wasn't a showboater in the Gospels we read. Was he a showboater? No. He wasn't a showboater. And I was like, oh, wow, now Jesus is showboating. He's really putting himself out there. hey, Paul, whoa. And Paul just, did he go blind? There's 3 different accounts of the story, or Saul's story. But it seems like there's some showboating going on there. I'm like, I've always looked at it that way. Like, how would I trust that if I'm, he was humble and he didn't want the recognition that way. It seems like,
The closest thing that I can get to Jesus showboating in Paul's letters is when Paul says, let me forget, was this in 1 or 2 Corinthians? I can find out in 2 seconds. 1 Corinthians 15:6. There it is. Paul says that 500 people had saw Jesus at once. Never mentions them again. Here, Paul or Sophanes is writing that because they both wrote it. They wrote the letter to the first, or the series of letters that's called 1 Corinthians. Either way.
I don't know if showboating is a good word to use. It's just now that it's.
It probably
yeah.
I get what you're
saying. Yeah. He's like a movie star now. He's just like making this grandiose appearance to Saul that seems out of the character of Jesus, according to what I've read. That, wow, that's kind of grandiose. It's like, boom. Like, I'm not too sure about that. I don't know if I trust this guy's account. I don't know if I trust it. This doesn't seem right. Seems like out of character for Jesus to do something like that. Just my opinion.
Yeah.
It's an opinion.
I think it's a good opinion. Paul, even if him being a former persecutor doesn't move anybody, just read the arrogance in Galatians, the sheer arrogance. He thinks he knows Jesus better than James, Jesus' brother. And Jesus, a man he never met. And he's saying that somehow he knows Jesus better than James, who did meet Jesus, his own brother. Because, that's his brother. Of course he met him. I'm like, wow, Paul, a vision tells you more about Jesus than James could ever discover. James, Jesus' brother. That's ridiculous. How can anybody trust that? It's beyond me.
Yeah. That's true.
See more interesting stuff in the chat. I'm going through the letters real quick.
Yeah.
We'll take a couple more questions and I'll just think we can head off.
Let's see here. I don't have my glasses on tonight. Family, History Valley family, so I'm squinting a little bit. Yeah, I don't know about the basket thing because, an adult in the basket. I'm just looking through. James was killed by Paul.
Yeah, according to Clement, he was.
Here's a comment.
Saul, by the way, not Paul.
Paul was a grifter and a liar and a murderer. Just an opinion from the chat.
Well,
he was responding to somebody. I mean, it's like he was responding to somebody.
I mean, Paul and Saul can be both guilty of that.
Yeah, it seems like he odd to me that he would switch from a Hebrew to a Latin. And he said Paul was a grifter and a liar and a murderer. Well, we see that he was a murderer, I would say for sure. That's why he's not really my favorite biblical character, if you want to use, if I can use that word. Let me see what we got here. Just looking back, I'm backing up a little bit. Here we go. EBO Knight. It seems that Acts was written as a legal appeal brief to Nero's magistrate Theophilus. What do you think about that, Jacob?
I've never heard of that claim before.
Yeah, I've never heard of that one either. Legal appeal.
That doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah.
I appreciate your question.
Yeah, appreciate the question. A legal appeal in Acts. Well,
I don't see it. I really don't.
Just bringing it up.
And Acts can't be written that early. There are some scholars like Carl L. Armstrong and others that will date Acts that early. I respect his opinion.
Yeah.
His work is interesting, but I don't agree with the ultimate conclusion. I think Steve Mason is right. Acts is early 2nd century CE. No Josephus. I think he's right about that. I'm on board with that. I think Luke, Acts are both using Josephus. They're written by the same guy anyway. So Luke, Acts, written by the same person. 2 volumes of the same work. So
I was going to bring that up a little earlier, but you did. That's fine, Jake.
There we go. There we go.
You know, I don't see how Luke comes right away saying he has the perfect understanding of Jesus, and that's like, well, how do you have the perfect understanding if you never knew him?
I also think
I'm keeping it real. Like, I mean, I can't have the perfect understanding of the Woodstock concert, though I was born in 1969. I wasn't there. I've heard about it. I've seen documentaries. I've heard people talk about it, but I don't have the perfect understanding of that because I just simply wasn't there.
You could just simply say you had the vision of Woodstock.
Yeah, I could admire Woodstock. I could, you know, really embellish the story.
No, I was just making a joke. You could just claim that you had a vision of Woodstock, and you know them better than everybody that went there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, here's a super chat question, Jacob.
All right.
From Porter Rockwell, enjoyer. How do you believe Gnosticism started, Jacob? How do you believe Gnosticism started? That's
an interesting question.
Jacob, do you think then that Gnosticism predates, if you will, Christianity? Because that's a controversial way of looking at it. Do you think it predates the Christian movement, Gnosticism?
Let me put it this way. There are forms of Gnosticism that were not necessarily Christian Gnosticism that did exist prior to Christianity. But the question is really, do I think Christian Gnosticism came first? What Gnosticism entails is that a deity created the physical world, Yaldabaoth, born out of chaos, or son of chaos. And that this deity is not the father of Jesus. Jesus is the son of a different God. And it tries to get people to find gnosis directly to God. Not through Jesus, but directly to God. And this, and that Jesus is the son of a different God, not the God of the Old Testament, but the son of a different, more benevolent deity. The monad is what the deity is called. And he's coming here to free us from Yaldabaoth, who is being identified with the devil, which I just laugh every time I think about that. I'm like, are you kidding me? Satan and Yahweh are both in the Old Testament. They're two different characters. They can't be the same person. In Jewish apocryphal literature, Satan is rebelling against Yahweh, and this is in text way before the New Testament was composed. So I'm like, that's the Gnostics are really cherry picking here. They're like, let's forget all the apocryphal literature, let's forget all that, and they're just cherry picking the Old Testament. Let's pretend the Old Testament doesn't talk about the devil because the devil is somehow Yahweh, even though the Old Testament says Satan and Yahweh are two different people. So I'm like, I think Gnosticism is a blunder, a disaster. That being said, I think Gnosticism started after Christianity.
Okay.
That's my answer to that question. In the 2nd century CE. I do not buy that it's earlier at all.
I've heard it the other way around. Just a question, you know. And I'm like, well, you know.
There were Christians seeking a form of gnosis even as early as Paul's letters. Well, the term Christian didn't exist yet, but that kind of gnosis is not the kind that I was just talking about. It looks like to me Gnosticism in the form we understand it, the anti-demiurgism, if you want to put it that way, the idea of turning Christianity into an anti-demiurge cult, which is what the Gnostics were trying to do. It looks like that began with Marcion. There are those who are going to question, we shouldn't call Marcion Gnostic. Like, well, he sure looks like one to me in a lot of ways. He says the same thing. Jesus is the son of a different God. God of the Old Testament is evil. He says the God of the Old Testament is the devil. Sounds a lot like Gnosticism to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me looks like it started the idea. Even if one doesn't call Marcion a Gnostic, I think one cannot deny that Marcion is responsible for pushing the idea. And the Gnostics at least keyed off him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because that's my answer to that question.
There you go.
Let me see something here.
Okay. I don't know what that. I'm just reading. No glasses today. Huh?
No problem. Take your time.
I'm gonna bring up this one here. It's not a super chat, but
yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I'm taking both tonight.
Mm-hmm. Since
New
when
Genesis
did Jesus,
connection?
Yeah. Since when did Jesus ever talk to anyone quoting a pagan god? As in the quote, "Why does thou kick at the pricks?" A quote from Euripides in the play Bosch, written about Euripides. Okay, written in about 400 BC.
I think this involves the Eucharist. I think it's in 1 Corinthians 15.
Mm-hmm.
Let me make sure I get that right before I comment.
Mm-hmm.
Corrections in 1 Corinthians 11. But I was right, it's in 1 Corinthians. So, yeah, I don't think he said that. I think either Paul made that up, or his co-author made it up, or an interpolator put that into 1 Corinthians. I think it's most likely that one of them made it up. I don't think that's an interpolation.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I agree. There's no way to hit the Torah Orthodox Jesus ever said anything like that. No way. That's a Hellenistic invention. And I believe either Paul or Sophanes is responsible for inventing that in 1 Corinthians 11, creating that nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
That was not said by the historical Jesus. I'm certain of that.
There you go. There you go. And again, I'm just cherry picking at this point.
That's okay. That's how this works. Yeah, just pick which
Wait a minute. How about this?
We're gonna take.
How about this?
Oh, there we go.
I had them sitting off to the side. Now I can't get them on because I have the headphones on. Did I sit on these? Yeah, I done broke them anyway. I broke the glasses.
Damn. When did you do that? Just now?
Probably at work.
Oh, at work?
Yeah. I'm sure I did. Wow. Well, that stinks. Guess not. They're cheap reading glasses anyway. These aren't the real deal.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. Yeah, look. If I can get them in the camera. This arm here. Whoops. This one here is.
Wow.
Yeah, I screwed them up. Dang it. Well, I'll just struggle through it then.
No problem.
Wow.
The way you were saying that was making me laugh.
Yeah, I'm upset now. Oh well.
I'm sorry about that.
Probably broke them at work, but oh well.
Yeah. Let me mute myself for a second.
Yahweh is the. Ooh, what's this here? Yahweh is the Vesper. Yahweh is the father of the devil in an alternative reading of John and 1 Corinthians. I'll wait till Jacob comes back. Now, you see this one, Jacob? This is just a controversial comment.
Yeah, the alarm went off, so I was dealing with that.
Okay.
But
Yahweh is the father of the devil in an alternative reading of John and First Corinthians.
Well, I mean, to me, that's not really an alternate reading of anything. I mean, he created them. I mean, I would obviously agree that at least in the way the Bible is portraying it, Yahweh is the father of the devil. Why not? I mean, as for John, I wonder what you're talking about there. Perhaps John 8:44, which I think John 8:44 is extremely anti-Semitic, because what it says.
John 8:44.
Yeah, looks like Kevin Hogan Channel brought it up at the same time, just after I brought it up. Okay, what's the big deal about John 8:44? Well, it's literally saying the Jews are the sons of the devil, the first murderer. So, like, okay, so what John 8:44 just did is basically say Cain is Satan, and all Jews descend from Cain. That is how I always interpreted John 8:44. That's what John 8:44 is trying to say. And the Gospel of John is, I think, is very anti-Semitic, possibly the most anti-Semitic of the four Gospels. It's really pushing the idea that the Jews killed Jesus. It's really pushing it and slamming it down your throats, all the readers. Everyone that reads it can't miss what John's trying to say. And it's really trying to obfuscate. Not obfuscate, but trying to deflect, trying to say, I ain't the Romans' fault, it was the Jews. They did it. And it's trying to put more emphasis on that by making them the descendants of Cain. That's how I look at it. In fact, let me pull that up right now. You can go ahead and flip to another question.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah,
because Edward commented on the same thing. Edward Missioner, if I'm reading it correctly, squinting. I read Yahweh as the father of the devil too in John 8:44. That means Beelzebub is Yahweh's demon youngling to be consistent.
Well, it looks like that Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, is the New Testament's version of the Baal from the Old Testament. And for those that don't know, Baal is not a name of any specific god; it's a title in the Canaanite religion. Balu. Baal is Hebrew. Balu is how you say Ugaritic in Canaanite, Phoenician. Balu is Balu is actually a title. It means Lord for several different deities. Which one that the Old Testament is talking about, that the Hebrew Bible hates so much? My suspicion is it's Balu Haman, a Carthaginian deity in which infants were sacrificed to him. They would load the infant inside those bulls, those artificial bulls that they made, and they would heat it up. Pretty gruesome, evil, and disgusting. Yeah. But that seems to be the only one that the Baal of the Old Testament seems to fit the description of, in my view, is Balu Haman. It also looks like Balu Haman is the inspiration for the fictional deity called Moloch. Because the scholars will point out there doesn't seem to be a real deity called Moloch, so it looks like Moloch is based upon Balu Haman, from my assessment.
It's a little tricky too. Once you get into like the realm of comparative mythology, sometimes you have one and the same character. One is a benevolent and one is a benevolent, and they're actually still one and the same. I hate to say it that way. Once you fast forward to like, and I hate to use these examples, to movies, Anakin Skywalker was a good guy, and he was also Darth Vader. He was also Darth Vader. You know him as being benevolent, and you also know him as being malevolent. So toponymy, I think that's a word when you deal with like language, and different cultures have their own toponymy for deities, etc. It can be a little confusing, but I hate to use the generic example of Anakin versus Darth Vader. Moloch looks to be a malevolent or a very malevolent deity that
malevolent.
Malevolent. Some would say that Moloch and El are one and the same.
That's ridiculous.
Some comparative mythologists would say they're one and the same.
Yeah, there's no evidence of that, because it was Balu Haman that they committed infant sacrifice to. It's they're not El. It was
no, correct. No, you're right. Correct. I absolutely agree. But still the idea, and again, that's in the that just goes into, because comparative mythology is comparative linguistics. It's the same time, so it can be confusing, but still you have benevolent, malevolent. You know,
another false comparison that really pisses me off every time I hear it is Saturn is Satan because it sounds alike. I'm like, are you kidding me? Please.
The pseudo-linguistics, yeah.
Look, number one, let's get something straight here. Kronos got his butt kicked by Zeus. Saturn getting defeated by Jupiter, same story. So, what did the devil do, right? He rebelled against God and failed. How does that fit? Doesn't. But people that want to be stupid and say they're the same, can't help them.
Jacob, we have another super chat coming up here from Fiction Mission. Was Paul a Roman infiltrator? Was Paul a Roman infiltrator?
I think yes, because remember he's a Herodian. He's literally friends with the Praetorian Guard in the Imperial Palace. Yeah,
you use the same reference, Jacob.
Yeah, I mean it's to me it's easy.
Yeah,
it's an easy yes. Yeah, that's it. I mean, all I can do is repeat myself. So. Let me just say real quick, I've had to correct people over and over again, misinterpreting James Valiant. This guy's mythicist, and Valiant is the one that really gets misinterpreted a lot, misrepresented. Several people have assumed he's a mythicist. I'm like, no.
No.
Yeah, Valiant's not a mythicist. He never was.
Yeah.
Never. Same story with me. In fact, I might do a video about that at some point later, because there is more details there I'd like to talk about, but not tonight. But yeah, thank you for the super chat, Fiction Mission. Appreciate it.
Here's a good comment here. Yep.
Same one?
Yeah.
Yeah, Kevin. I appreciate what you said here. Yeah, they know, but there are some people out there that misrepresent me anyway. That's how it works. I mean, that's always going to be an issue. It sucks, but I just got to deal with it. But yeah, that's right, Kevin. And thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Really
Yeah,
appreciate the compliment.
another super chat came up from Porter Rockwell Enjoyer. Do you believe ancient Israelites believed in a corporal God? 72 elders that saw God with feet on precious stone. Abraham ate with God, etc.
Interesting question. I would have to say yes, because even in the book of Exodus, it says the Lord is a man of war. The emphasis that God is a man is stated several times in the Hebrew Bible. Yeah, of course he ate. Yeah, he ate with Abraham. Absolutely. There's no escape that he's a corporal God, and also an imperfect God. Because in the book of Genesis, he doesn't know where Adam and Eve are. He's trying to find
Where
them.
are you? Yeah, where are you?
Yeah.
Where are you? God, you should already know. True.
Very true, the Hebrew Bible does not believe God knows everything. It does not. So when someone says God is omnipotent and omniscient and has omniscience, remind them of Genesis, please. Doesn't work.
Jacob, I go on other shows and I have discussions with people, and I brought these things up and issues up in an ontological argument. I'm like, guys, you're not reading what the scriptures say. God is not perfect. And they're like, whoa, what do you mean? I'm like, you're not reading the scriptures? Come on, man. I mean, just because these ontological arguments and these philosophical arguments are way older than us by several hundred years. And I'm like, I'm reading the scriptures. I see what it says. And it doesn't look like God is this omnipotent, perfect God. I'm with you, Jacob, 100%. Like, yeah. Thus, we don't live in a perfect world at all. We don't.
Yeah.
Wish we did. Wish we did. Man, it'd be nice.
Yeah, it would.
I'm with you on that, Jacob. Yeah, man.
I mean, Deuteronomy 32, and I said this before, Deuteronomy 32 is where my research began. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8 to 9. The Lord inherited Israel from a higher God, the Most High God, Ha El Elyon. Yeah. Yep. I'm like, that's not the same dude. Well, he inherited him himself. I'm like, you're not going to inherit your own taxes.
No.
Shut up with that. Those are people that say that to me. It's just come on. That's not the same person. Even in the Dead Sea Scrolls version of Deuteronomy, it's even more explicit. It's like it says in the Dead Sea Scrolls version of Deuteronomy 32 that each country received its own God from the Most High, and the Lord's portion was Israel. I'm like, that's even more specific. Makes it worse.
Yeah.
But some people just want to pretend, oh, there's nothing to see there. I'm like, okay, well, you be you then. We got anything else?
Well, there's no more super chat questions, Jacob.
Well, what about a regular one?
We have new Genesis connection again. This is my conclusion that Paul's teaching split the early first century church, East and West, West being Rome and East being the 7 churches of Asia that were organized under John, 2 separate doctrines.
I don't really think John and Paul are 2 different doctrines, but when it comes to stuff like Galatia, and then again, not even Galatia, because even when I look at it there, Galatia was succumbing to Torah orthodoxy, and Paul was getting pissed off at that. And it looked like the Ephesians were also succumbing to Torah orthodoxy, but it looks like Timothy and Paul managed to put a stop to that as Paul was working on in Ephesians and 2 Timothy. So, like when Paul wrote 2 Timothy, or was it 1 Timothy? I don't remember which one of those Timothys was trying to remind Timothy, hey, look, man, you gotta. No, it was 2 Timothy. I think it was 2 Timothy. Paul was trying to tell Timothy, you've got to deal with those Ephesians. You got to make sure they follow my doctrine. And it looks like it would have to. 2 Timothy would have to be after Ephesians to make sense of that. Have to be, Because Ephesians is like, okay, guys, y'all going way off the train tracks. Get back to the theology I taught you. But Timothy's down there. He's trying to get everybody under control. Like, follow Paul's doctrine, everybody. So Paul sends a letter to Timothy saying, please don't fail me right now. Don't fail me, Timothy. Get it done. Make sure they follow my theology.
There you go. Well,
yeah, that's the best I can do to answer that question.
Yeah.
If you call it an answer.
Yeah. More or less.
Well, let's take a couple more, and I'm getting out of here.
Yeah.
I think we're both getting tired.
Yeah, the audience doesn't know that I'm a late worker. I'm not an early worker. I'm a late worker.
Yeah.
Steph of Flanders is just here to say good morning from Europe. So,
well, good morning.
I like to bring that up just because now we're late at night. It's where I am. It's 2:14 in the a.m. 2:14, and I'll be up in a few more hours, doing my daily routine, and back to it. I enjoyed this talk though, and we kind of got loose a little bit and laid back and made some Star Wars references at times. It's just fun. It's fun. I enjoy doing these co-hosting shows with you, Jacob, as always.
The pleasure's mine, man.
Oh, yeah, man. You want to end it, Jacob? It's on you, brother. It's up to
I guess we'll end it with Kevin Hogan channel saying, gentlemen, great discussion. Well, thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate it. And that being said, DjSeanski, thank you for joining me tonight. This was awesome. Let's do this again sometime. Hopefully next time we'll have Jim Valiant with us.
Yeah.
He was unable to make it. He was originally supposed to be here. He couldn't make it.
Oh, man. Always a pleasure to speak to him. Always.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody, for the views and for watching, the questions, and the super chats especially. And I'll see everybody later. Good night.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.